You know me, I always like to get the bombshell out of the way early. This was an above-average game. Now, if that sounds harsh, that's because it is. But where do I even begin? I did try to do a little bit of behind-the-scenes looking into on this one, but I found very little actual, tangible information on the making of. I do know that the marketing campaign was certainly done better than usual, and they did go for the simultaneous release, which is nice. I know the game sold quite well, too, which is good, actually. This is one of the best-selling Tales of games, and is on track to becoming the best-selling Tales of game. So that's awesome. I do think it's an above-average game, and while that might not sound very positive, it is still net positive, which is something I think needs to be mentioned. Because, good God, this game has issues. But before you jump down my throat, I want to mention something. I was looking at my notes over here, which I've got right here, and I noticed that of the gameplay negatives, 14 of them were for up to Chapter 5, and then the other 19 were for after Chapter 5. And that's the first thing I wanted to talk about. This is actually a fairly complex and nuanced topic, and something that I still butt heads with people on, even as recently as literally yesterday. It's the idea of a game being too long. Now, anybody who actually knows me, which I honestly think is only a small percentage of you at this point, because people keep saying things on my YouTube comments that aren't true. But I think those of you who actually know me know that the length of the game doesn't matter to me at all. The length is irrelevant to my enjoyment of the game, completely. Now, that is my fault and my flaw. To me, I don't care if it's long, short, or in between. What I care about is density. I care about how good the game is for how long. We actually were talking about this during the stream. We came up with, and it's easy to come up with several games that are quite long, that are even longer than this game, that are still quite enjoyable and retain enjoyability throughout. And of course, there are shorter games that are worse. The length doesn't matter, it's what you use it for, and what you do with it, right? This came up just earlier this year. I don't even remember the games, but there was a game we played which was like 15 hours and a game which was 30. The game that was 15 hours felt longer and scored worse. But again, because of how they used their time. Sense make? The reason I bring that up is because this game absolutely uses its time terribly. But it doesn't really get particularly bad until that one point, about Chapter 5. The seams start to show, and from then on, you can really tell that something was going on behind the scenes. The quality of dungeon design and enemy design and boss design and the difficulty curve and the progression curve and the level, just the overworld design stops at a certain point. The quality of cutscenes starts to dip down substantially. The quantity of cutscenes gets worse. The ratio of gameplay to story gets way worse. Like, we have a little bit of the Xenogears problem here, so very minor spoiler for those of you not aware. In Xenogears, when you get to, Disc 2, the infamous Disc 2, well, the gameplay kind of stops. It doesn't completely stop. There's still some gameplay there, but it sort of turns into a not quite interactive movie, which I know is an argument that people have leveled at JRPGs for years, and it's a very stupid one, because there's always been some actual gameplay. But in that case, not quite so much, and it's the same problem here. It actually really does turn into a movie. It got to the point where, and I'm not joking, we'd talk to someone, and then a skit would pop up, so we'd watch the skit, then a new skit would pop up, so we'd watch the skit, and then we'd walk, and I want you to look, here's the woman we're talking to, and we're here, and we go about here, maybe 10 feet away, and then we'd trigger another cutscene and another skit. And then we'd go further down the road to trigger another cutscene, and so forth, and so on. It became relentless. Now, I should probably mention that if these cutscenes were good, this would actually work out okay-ish. It wouldn't bother me as much, to put it in such terms. It would still be a negative, but it would just be a negative for the density and the relentless nature of the cutscenes. Slathering the cutscenes is what I like to... Like, picture you're making a sandwich or a burger, and condiment of your preference is something you can add to it. Or, hear me out, you can just slather it all over it until it's completely drowned in it and destroys the flavor and the palate. And that's what this game does with its cutscenes. Now you're probably thinking how this relates to gameplay, but if you're paying attention, this is absolutely tied into gameplay, because I started playing another game on the side so I would have something to do while I was listening to and watching the cutscenes. Because there was no gameplay at all. Unless you count, walking 10 feet to trigger the next cutscene or hitting the button to trigger the skit, and that's it. Now, if you heard me for a second, you noticed that I mentioned that this would have been acceptable if the quality of the cutscenes was good. Are these cutscenes good? Okay, so I want you to picture something, okay? Where's a book? I should have had a book ready. You know what? We use Sam and Fuzzy. It's a good webcomic. I highly recommend it. So let's imagine we've got a book here. This is a decent-sized book. And we open it up, and there's just something amazing, and there's something else amazing, and it's all good. It's cool stuff. There's some great storytelling, great character stuff. They're smart. They're thinking about the future. Everything here is cool. Now I want you to imagine for a moment that someone looks at this book and says, well, hang on. This is way too short. We need to have that length. We need to make the game longer. Part of the reason I say this is such a nuanced topic is because a huge percentage of gamers and people who pay for video games, let's just put that into simple terminology, want the games to be longer. Maybe they don't have that much money to buy that many games, or maybe they want a good return on their investment, or maybe they just want something they can play to distract themselves from their life for a while, or whatever. There's reasons. There's plenty of reasons to want a game to be longer. It's why I don't really toss shade at the people. The problem is what that has done for the last 40 years is encouraged bad game design, demonstrably bad game design, in order to make games longer. Like, for example, let's say they take this section, and then this section, and then this section. And I don't have enough fingers to really do this properly, but just imagine for a moment that every single bit of this book has these extra little sections. Remember, the core book, the part that you're seeing here, which is the pages, is excellent. It's great. I'm with it. But then there's all this extra space in between, and now the book is this long. This is a terrible visual metaphor, but you're going to have to work with it. This isn't even a metaphor. This is showcasing. Visual storytelling? This is padding and repetition and padding of repetition. I'd make a joke here, but I want to stress that I am not being facetious when what would happen is they would say, there's an explosion over there. And in a good game, what would happen is the explosion would go off, and they'd be like, and then, the main character, Bob, would look at Bobina and be like, because Bobina, has this big traumatic past about explosions, but she nods. She's like, yeah, let's do it. And he's like, okay. And then they go to the explosion. But what happens in this game is the explosion happens. Same traumatic past. Bob says, did you hear that explosion? Why, yes, I did hear an explosion. Are we sure that was actually an explosion? It could have been something else. Well, I think that what we probably heard has a high chance of being an explosion. It did happen in that direction, and we do know that there's explosive materials over there. And don't forget, we also know that the evil Empire of Doom is making an attack over there right now. That's a good point. Thank you for bringing that up. Of course. So what you're saying is we definitely have an explosion over there. But what do we do about it? Well, why is this even a question? Let's just go and stop the explosion. Well, now hang on a second there. We haven't taken into account Bobina's effects. Yes, that's right. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be insensitive. No, it's okay. I'm still getting over the fact that I have a bit of a problem with explosions. That's right. We shouldn't forget the problem with explosions that she has. But I know you didn't mean to be insensitive. No, it's my fault. I'm sorry. It's okay. But I think if there's even a chance we could help those people by those explosions, maybe we should go to the explosions and help them. Are you sure about that? Yes, I think that would be the best for the situation. All right, well, if she's committed, then I'm committed too. Yeah, I've got your back. That's right. We'll be able to stop those explosions or whoever's causing them. I hope so, for all the others like me, so that they will never have to suffer what I've suffered through. Agreed. Yeah, let's do it. Okay, and then they go to the explosions. I'm not exaggerating. Because what happens is actually worse than that. Because then what happens is on the way to the explosions, you have another cutscene. It might be a skit, or it might be an actual fully animated cutscene, but either way, there's another voice-acted bit where they talk about the explosions and what could have been causing them. And maybe they need to go check this out, but I don't know. But she does have this tragic past about explosions. That's right, because that tragic past happened, and we need to acknowledge that. That's true. But maybe we should go check it out. Yeah, I think we should go check out the explosions. And then when they get to the site of the explosions, there's a third cutscene where they talk about everything that I just said again. The repetition is insane in this game. I get that repetition, I don't like it, but I get that repetition is the kind of thing that can and should exist in any long-form storytelling, because not everyone has the memory and not everyone has the time. That's understandable. This isn't that. This is treating me like I am 3 years old. This is absolutely slamming it into my face over and over and over and over again until I'm just so sick of it. But, so that's the biggest problem in the game in a nutshell, I would say. The fact that the game should have stopped about 15 or so hours before it did, and just padded itself out entirely too much. But I haven't even talked about the gameplay yet. Not really. So what did the gameplay do well? Going into the specifics would actually take a little bit of time, because I can't just say the combat's good, because the combat is good and bad. Okay, so that isn't helpful for you. So is the combat fun? Yes and no. Okay, I know you're just wanting to slug me at this point, but that's the whole reason why I do this review format. That's the entire reason why I have the pluses and minuses system. I don't actually just say this good, this bad. It's more like, well, these particular things were done well, and these particular things were done poorly. Things that are done good. I like the CP being shifted over to a party mechanic. I like the fact that there are unique and individual ways each of the party member plays, both as yourself and as them, mostly for yourself, whoever you're controlling. So you have a variety of play style, which allows you to change up, not just like which kind of attack you're using, but you've got Law's ability to have acceleration, or you've got the dodge mechanic on Dohalim, etc. It literally changes how you are trying to play the game, and that's good. I like the fact that there's a great punchiness to it, and a great flow to most of the combat up until Chapter 5, where you get into combat very quickly, you push through combat very quickly, and you push out of combat very quickly. One of the things I talk about all the time is seconds and minutes. There are no seconds and minutes in the game's combat up until Chapter 5. It's just in, go, out, boom. And it's wonderfully done, and has a wonderful pace and flow to it. Before you ask, yes, I did actually try it on hardest difficulty, the unknown DLC difficulty, to really crank the HP up, which is something they do wrong, by the way, because in this game, the only thing the difficulty changes is how much, well, 3 things. It changes how much health they have, how much damage they do, and your bonus multiplier, which changes how much SP and experience gain you get. So if you turn it down to easy, you literally level slower. So that sucks. But I did crank it up to try and level for a bit there, and again, the same punchiness was true. The combat actually obviously lasted longer, because the enemies had more health, but it was still very punchy, very tightly constrained, very well constructed. The arts are amazing, as they pretty much always are. Learning arts is amazing. I already mentioned the CP mechanic. I'm actually looking at my notes over here. Player AI is decent. The pseudo gambits are decent. There's some good stuff with indicating where side quests are. You can literally see it on the map, in addition to being able to see the little icon over their head, which shows whether or not you've talked to someone or not as well, which is really cool. There's a couple of good boss fights and a couple of good encounters. There's also, the game is visually gorgeous and has decent music. The game also uses its music terribly, has an actual absence of enemy variety, likes to repeat not only the same enemy types, but the same boss encounters over and over and over with a reskin in many cases. A lot of bosses become trash encounters without actually bringing them down to the level of trash encounter, which means a lot of the combat from Chapter 5 and onwards becomes extraordinarily padded, as the enemies have 90,000 or 100,000 or 200,000 HP, and you're just chipping your way through the giant carapace of the crab monsters. or it's the behemoth. I kept calling them the behemoths. It's the four-legged things, and there's the chameleon version, and then there's like the roaring two-headed version, but it's the same damn fight over and over and over. Never mind the fact that most of the other fights are, again, pretty much the same fights endlessly. There's the fact that each of your party members has a special thing which they can do to interfere with the fight and to refill your AP, your ability to use your art points, which is cool, except for the fact that the way the amount that it costs to refill those takes a little bit, which means if you misuse it, sucks to be you, and if you like interrupt one particular enemy, like you use, oh my god, I can't think of her name, Kisara, in order to interrupt a charging enemy, and then another enemy charges right after, well, it sucks to be you because her ability is effectively on cooldown. She doesn't have the ability to use it again, so that sucks. There's the fact that there's this weird mechanic that they've been using the entire game. It's this roar, where the enemy just roars and does nothing. They just go, roar, and all it is, literally, is someone saying, hold on, and pausing the fight for a moment. They don't attack you during that period of time. They don't do anything with it. They just say, hold on. Okay. It's hard to explain how weird this game controls. And I actually spent some time trying to come up with terminology to explain it on camera. So first of all, obviously each character controls differently, but there's two big issues that get in the way. One is camera overrides movement in a way that makes it hard to actually hit the enemies. And two is the fact that the tracking is actively bad. This was true all the way up into quite literally the last boss of the game, where even when just hands-offing and allowing the game to home in and track me to the enemy, I'd say about half my attacks were literally just swinging past or over the head of the enemy. This is true whether the enemy is small or large, by the way. Because if you don't understand what I mean by tracking, let's say I have an attack. It's 3 swipes right in front of me. Each swipe drags me forward a little bit. So if I begin this attack at the enemy, the first swipe hits them, and the second swipe goes right past them because I'm moving forward. And then the third swipe tries to turn me towards the enemy, but I fail at hitting them. Or maybe I don't turn at all, depending on the move, and I just hit right past them. And this is really problematic for smaller enemies, but surprisingly problematic for big enemies too, because on most big enemies you have a big weak point you're trying to hit. So what you do is you swipe, and then you swipe, and then you swipe, and now you're hitting their hindquarters instead of the giant weak point up front. Stuff like that. This tracking problem was always an issue in the whole game, but it just gets worse the further into you get. Now, there are ways to mitigate this. If you are playing as Shion, she's ranged, so she bypasses the problem entirely. Same thing with Rinwell. Another one is Kisara, who has several homing abilities, which aren't the best, but they home in, so they go straight to the enemy and then hit. And it's usually a singular hit. And, of course, the best one, which is Dohalim, who completely ignores this issue by virtue of, rather than his attacks, hurt box being this tiny little sliver, his hurt box is this giant whirlwind of death around him, because almost all his attacks are innately AoE. So, there's the issue in a nutshell. But you're probably thinking, so why didn't you do any of that, Lore? Because Alphen does more DPS than everyone else by a huge margin. I'm pretty sure there are other ways to do more DPS if you are actually min-max in the game, but my Alphen was absolutely curb-stomping everyone else on the metaphorical DPS meters. Even more so when I started actually raising the Flame Strike ability and started being able to dish out thousands upon thousands of damage with a single hit, whereas everyone else is doing a few hundred per swing. Yeah. And I could mention other things. The dungeons tend to suck, and the bosses tend to suck. But I want to home in on something, because if you've been paying attention, Chapter 5 is when things really got bad on both the narrative and the gameplay axis. I'm going to go ahead and put up a spoiler warning here, because in order to keep going, I kind of need to start talking about things I've been avoiding. So spoiler warning in 3. So Chapter 5 is Volron's chapter, if you're not familiar with the numbering off the top of your head. Chapter 3, which is where we recruit Dohalim and Kisara, is the best chapter in the game. I don't think I gave a single negative to the entire sequence. It was awesome. It was well thought out, well constructed, well paced. It tackled a very complex and nuanced situation in a relatively well done manner. It was this part of the book, right? So that was awesome. Then we move on to Chapter 4, which only wasn't the worst chapter in the game because the final chapter exists. Chapter 4 is terrible. It tries at an absolute base level surface level comparison of, oh my gosh, but people can be evil even if they're Danans? What? Even though we established this earlier? And characters just act completely out of character, and one of the worst cutscenes in the game is there, and it's just it's this nonsense. It's nonsense. The main villain, the super evil woman of that, has a grand total of 3 cutscenes to her in the entire chapter. It's also when the seams start to show. Because you still have a couple of dungeons, and you still have an overworld section. But then you get to Chapter 5, which has 1 overworld section and 1 dungeon. And that's when it, like I mentioned, the production problems really start to come to the forefront. There's a portion in Chapter 5 where the story sequencing starts to pull an FF4, a.k.a. be bad. Because your ship falls, and oh my god, fade to black, and then we have a flashback, and then we wake up, and we're on the shore by ourselves. But no, it's okay, our party members are right there. Everyone's here, actually. In fact, the ship is fine, and so is the guy who ran it. We don't find that out till later, but it's true. Okay. But he also kidnapped Shion. We must rescue Shion. Good character moment. Remember, there's still pages of the actual good story here. This is why it was so damn frustrating. There was no point at which I could just say, okay, this part sucks, let's skip it. Because there's always individual pages of actual quality periodically throughout the story, which is actually really frustrating, but I digress. So, okay, we got this. We go through the 1 overworld section, and then we have a really horrific scene. Well done. And then we have one of the worst, the second worst dungeon in the game. I even wrote down its frickin' name. It's Castle Falras, I think. Yeah, excuse me, Delfaras. Delfaras Castle. Delfaras Castle is a grand total of 3 cells, 3 areas that you can go through. And it has enemies which have so much armor, and it is specifically armor, that fighting them takes absolutely forever. And remember, you can only break their armor periodically because of the aforementioned issue I already pointed out. So you just slug your way through this place. And it took me over 40 minutes to get through this dinky dungeon just because of how long the encounters were. Then we fight Volron. It was dumb and boring, but I'll talk about him in a second. And then we move on. And then, as is the usual for Tales of games, I know I have never played a Tales of game that didn't have a big fake-out ending. We have the big fake-out ending, and surprise, we have to keep going. Then we have a month time skip, during which nothing changes or happens, and nobody acts like it's been a month. How bad is this? There's this one point in the story where they say, we've been talking to all the people for a way to get past those mountains, but we haven't figured out how to get past those mountains for a whole month. And we've checked the area for a month, and I'm being slightly exaggerated. We've checked the area for the last month, and we've talked to the people for the last month. But we've just not been able to figure out a way to get past those mountains. So you go out and you talk to 3 people, and one of them immediately tells you, oh yeah, it's over there. So you go over there, and there's a very obvious path leading up to a very obvious cave with a bunch of soldiers patrolling in front of it. And you couldn't find this in a month. If it had been a day, this would have worked. But a month is ludicrous. And for several other reasons, too, because apparently none of the characters talked to each other for a month and did anything for the people for a month. But I digress, because the next thing that happens is they decide to go through the cave, sure, why not, and immediately connect with other people who get them to the ship, which is fine, I mentioned that earlier, and go to find the giant thing which is ripping the soul energy out of the planet. Okay, cool, Lifestream being eaten, nom nom. So we gotta go stop Pac-Man, and we go to do another terrible dungeon, which pulls a trick. Now, in Delfaras Castle, there was a bit where we had to walk out. Teleportation was not allowed. There was no enemies. There was no nothing. It was just you had to walk back through the whole dungeon for no reason. Okay, that sucks. But then when you finish the whatever it's called dungeon, the Lifestream sucker dungeon, the straw dungeon, you have to walk back out again, but all the enemies have respawned. This is when the padding and the fact that they're having production issues really gets more blatant. By the way, they pull this trick again in the very next dungeon. So we get out, and it's like, all right, let's go to space. What? But where are we going to find it? Well, we have to find the spaceship that's been hidden for 300 years, and no one's ever found it. So we talk to one person who tells us to go to the nearby volcano, which is right next door, in walking distance. And then we fight an Ifrit, which, and like, oh my god, this feels like this is going to be the beginning of several boss fights. It's actually not. And then we find the spaceship. Do you see what I mean here? you can see this, that what happened is they had the skeleton of the story, the bare bones, and they said, okay, like you can almost hear the note that was like, flesh this out or add more detail here or make this a side quest, question mark. And instead it just happens. Things just start happening. Then we go to space, because of course we do, because this is now Star Ocean. And in space we find out an actually pretty cool sequence. It's when Dohalim really gets most of his actual character stuff. The conclusion of his arc, if you will, when he steps up to being a lord and manages the responsibility and faces his ex-friends. And it's very cool and awesome. The dungeon isn't great and the boss fight they're in is terrible, but it's okay. I hope you enjoyed that because it's the last gameplay you're going to have for 3 hours. I am not exaggerating. Remember how I said it gets worse from Chapter 5 on? Well, it never stops. It never stops escalating. Because I'm not joking. What happens is you then have a cutscene and a cutscene. Well, first you have to fight your way up to the dungeon again. I mentioned that. Then you have cutscene, 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 cutscene. Okay, we're going to get our ship. We're going to go to Rena. Oh no, we've been teleported over here. But there's a space station. Cutscenes, cutscenes, cutscenes. Big reveals that aren't actually big reveals. Cutscene, cutscene, cutscene. Okay, we go down to the planet. Cutscene, 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 cutscene. And then final dungeon. 3 hours of cutscenes with 0 gameplay in between. That's impressive. And then the final dungeon sucks. It's a repeated series of corridors with bad music and disinteresting visuals while fighting the same enemies we've been fighting since literally the beginning of the game. Almost all of which are either forced to be in our way or have giant amounts of armor, health, or both. There's a couple cool bosses on the way down, I'll give you that one. The actual last boss, the real last boss, was pretty decent. And then Volron shows up for absolutely no goddamn reason in order to make everything worse. Then we have our ending, and then we're done. That sounded a lot like a repetition of what's happening, but I wanted to run through the events so you understand why my tone is like it is right now, because I was enjoying myself quite a bit until Chapter 4. But even Chapter 4 was just a dip. It's like, okay, this sucked, but whatever. But then we hit Chapter 5, and then we hit Chapter 6, and then we hit Chapter 7. And it never stopped getting worse. If the game had literally ended at Chapter 5, I would be much more positive about this. If the game had actually properly designed its last 2 chapters, or its last 4 chapters, that would have been excellent. But instead what we have is this. So, I hear you saying, Lore, you're speaking positively about the game. What really carried it for you? Well, there's some cool concepts, there's some good visual storytelling. There's some really good moments, some really good cutscenes periodically that do some excellent stuff. I love the way they structure several elements of it. I love the way that they have wonderfully horrifying concepts, like the very nature of the hollowing and how that works, or the system that Syslodin, or however they pronounced it, had of forcing people to kind of sell out each other and building this whole series of mistrust. All some wonderfully horrifying stuff there. Some excellent skits. I love skits in the Tales of series, and the overwhelming majority of skits, like 95% of the skits, were awesome, either for character or for setting, or just for fluff, just for fun, just to have a little bit of a joke there. So all of that's excellent. Remember, the core point is, this book is great. That's not my problem. But if you wanted me to point to one thing that really dragged the story up for me, all I'm going to tell you is this. The net story score for this game is plus 23 to story. That would have been plus, hang on, math. plus 5, if not for one thing. The characters. One thing that I've heard repeatedly from people who've played this game, and I myself echo this thought extensively, is that these characters are awesome. I actually really love the cast. The main cast, predominantly, although the supporting cast is pretty good too. The main cast of characters are well written, well acted, well presented, well performed. They have interesting characterization. They have excellent character growth. All of them have an arc, and all of those arcs are concluded at some point or another. Almost every character has at least one chapter that's basically dedicated to them. And it works brilliantly. It's not even linear, too. It's not like, you get this character. Like we mentioned earlier, you gain Dohalim in Chapter 3, but Chapter 3 is Kisara's chapter. Dohalim's chapter is Chapter 6, when we go up to the space station. That's his real focus moment, and all of them have those kind of focus moments. They have great dynamic with each other, too. That's another thing. It's it's relatively easy to make a fiction, game, book, story, movie, whatever, where the characters are excellent. I say relatively easy, but there's formulas to it, right? There's patterning to it. You really polish the work. You spend a lot of time on the dialogue and how they talk and how they act and how they feel and what they're doing and how their arc goes. You get some really talented actors. You get some talented voice directors, which they have both of, by the way. Great voice acting, great voice direction in this game, legitimately. So well acted, well written, well performed, awesome. But that's relatively easy. What's much harder to do is to do that and also have good dynamics. I've talked about this before. The connecting threads between characters are vastly important and critically undervalued, in my opinion, in most work of fiction. Quark is a great character and Odo's a great character, but the way they interact with each other is its own completely separate element of story. That's awesome. And they nail that in here, too. The way that Alphen and Shion work, the way that Alphen and Law works, the way that Kisara and Law works, the way that Rinwell and Dohalim bounce off of each other, the way that Dohalim works well with Shion. There are so many connecting threads that are very well written, and their dynamic works excellently, in addition to them being excellent characters. If it wasn't for how awesome they are, I would be a lot harsher about this game. We've got Alphen, who's just a generally good person. At several points in time, he bemoans and laments who and what he is. But at the end of the day, he also serves as a wonderful foil. I jotted some extra notes here. Because he is a foil to Shion. He has a great deal of a very strong core, a degree of certainty and rightness about who and what he is, but he lacks the emotional complexity to really understand the world around him. Indeed, it is much thanks to the efforts of Zephyr over the first 2 chapters that really helps him to grow and learn and understand that, hey, guess what? Life's complicated. And credit where credit is due, the game frequently acknowledges how complex and complicated situations are. It is very rare that you kill the big evil bad thing and things get better. In fact, usually that's the exact opposite of what happens. And so trying to maneuver through this and try to make things better, which is a complex solution, is something the game pushes for significantly. And Alphen drifting from simple solution, your typical, Dragon Quest 1 type main character, to trying to be a more complex character, like a Dragon Quest 11 main character, is this wonderful arc that he goes through. But of course, this is in contrast to Shion, who starts off with no emotional core whatsoever, no strong certainty of self, and as we find out much later, her entire goal and purpose is literally just to die in a way that doesn't destroy the planet. But she has a great deal more experience, understanding, and nuance. She has that kind of emotional complexity to allow her to say, well, hang on, this, and that. The two work off of each other very well as a consequence. This is also another interesting thing, because there's other ways this comes in. He tends to focus on the individual, micro, whereas she tends to focus on the groups, macro. This is also relatively important because of their relative different in ages. Because for most of the game, in fact, about 5 chapters about the game, he has the experience and intellect and general history of being around for 1 year. Whereas she has had however many years I don't know how old she is. Although that's another thing to bring up. Before I move on to other characters in specific, do you notice that there's age groups and dynamics that they use that to good effect for? And I can't believe more JRPGs don't pull this exact same trick, because we have the kids, that's Rinwell and Law, we have the young adults, that's Alphen and Shion, and then we have the adults, which is Dohalim and Kisara. And they each fit into those roles, but the way they then counterbalance each other, there we go, the way they counterbalance each other helps to make the whole thing fit. They use that to good effect in multiple cutscenes and multiple story arcs. We should also mention, because I mentioned Volron, right? Now, I don't like Volron as a character. Let me just start with that. The fact that he's now that we're in spoiler terms, the fact that he's actually the final boss is ridiculous. At least it's a victory lap, as opposed to being a real fight, but what the hell? Either way, the fact that Volron is just completely surface level. He doesn't care about anything other than the bare bones, basic definitions. Admittedly, makes him a fairly good foil, not only to Alphen, but also to the entire party. Remember, complex solutions. Whereas Volron's solution is, I'm going to kill everything. The end. He is also an absolute tyrant who has beaten down and broken his people to the point where even without using magic or any kind of technology, which is a little bit silly, but whatever. He has broken the will of the people to the point where they can't do anything but obey. This is, of course, in contrast to Alphen and the entire party, who are all about not only freedom, but the recurring motif of breaking down walls. There's also some more basic stuff. Alphen uses fire, whereas Volron uses ice, which is, of course, the aspect of water. And I could also point out the fact that, Alphen wears rags of some sort or another, whereas Volron is clad in fineries and, like, this nice tunic, and he's got feathers and all that fun stuff. And, of course, Alphen has friends and allies, whereas Volron is completely alone. They could have done something cool with him. They didn't. Instead, what they did was they had him be there, and he's all right through chapter 5. Then he dies, and then he comes back in chapter 6 for some reason. 7, excuse me. No, 6, I'm right, 6 for some reason. And then he comes back in chapter 7 for absolutely no reason. And, well, I mean, the quality of the game is just tumbling down the stairs at that point in general, so whatever. But the other thing I wanted to mention really quick here, so before we move on, is each of the zones also kind of showcases a bit of the personality of the Lord in question, the one who's currently running it, which, if you sit and think about it, doesn't actually make sense, but it's a cool thematic thing for the purposes of the story. The bare rocks and the completely uncontrolled, savage, roaming tribes of, the first area under Balsac. We've also got... Balsef, that was his name. We've also got the second area where people are encouraged to manipulate and coerce each other and to sell out each other because it's the only way you can get ahead. Constant backbiting and infrastructure nonsense and all that, which is, of course, very indicative of how that person and his manipulative, illusory magics work. Then we move on to the third zone, which is effectively a seeming paradise, but actually really rotten underneath and has some horrible things going on behind the scenes, which the Lord doesn't even know about, which is very Dohalim and how much he actually doesn't want to have anything to do with the reality that sits around him. In fact, much of his character arc is dealing with that, which I wanted to pause for a moment and mention how Dohalim is actually probably my second favorite character in the game. Introducing an actual lord as a party member was an inspired choice, in my opinion. It gives us so much insight into a degree of Renan society that we wouldn't get otherwise. And in addition to that, it gives us a very unique perspective on things. He's not a bad person by any mark, but he constantly grates on the other characters for the first couple of chapters, for chapter 3 and chapter 4 as we're going through it, not really because he's doing it on purpose, but just because his mentality and his background are so different. And as those walls break down between him and the other characters and they start accepting each other as friends, he starts to change his personality a little bit and his dynamic, and he starts to flesh out. Effectively, to put it as bluntly as possible, the adult grows up. This is interesting because Kisara kind of has the inverse of this. She starts out from a perspective of emotional and general complexity and maturity. After all, she's the one who's used to kind of actually running the things. We learn early on that she's been doing a lot of the actual management, not just economically, but in terms of basic things like clothing and fishing and cooking and sewing and all the little details that require running, which Dohalim had been kind of ignoring because Lord, who was only surface level. So she already starts complex, but you might think, well, wait, does she get more simplistic? Not quite. It's more like over the course of her arc, she starts to accept that there's nothing wrong with every now and again just wanting something because you want something. Simplistic desires are, after all, not necessarily a bad thing. It's only when they are done to excess that we have a problem. So she starts to become a little bit more accepting and understanding of who she already is, whereas Dohalim grows into a more complex and interesting person. I hope the two have a wonderful life together because they're both amazing. I cannot gush enough about these two characters, by the way. Kisara is my favorite character in the game, and Dohalim is my second favorite character. The two of them are awesome. They're extremely well written, they're extremely tightly constructed, they're brilliantly acted, and their position and usage throughout the story is phenomenal. Kisara being the team mom, and Dohalim being the regent lord who's trying to learn to be better. Wonderful stuff. But then, of course, we go to the fourth zone, which we don't really get an insight into the Lord there as a result of the zone. It just looks like a place that's been bombed to hell. In fact, the way it's being constructed makes it feel like what we should be getting is an insight into Deadheim, the local, Danon Lord who's trying to take over in the wake of her defeat, which, of course, it wasn't a real defeat at all, but whatever. At best, I could say that maybe we're seeing a little bit of her negligence and total lack of caring over the realm she rules over, but even that I don't buy. And then, of course, naturally, the Wind Lord goes out on a ship for absolutely no reason. Because that's her real castle, is a ship. Anyways, so then, That ship doesn't survive the whirlpool, or at least if it does, we never hear about it again. Just the ship we took out to that ship survives. Somehow. Anyways. And then we get to Chapter 5, and admittedly, the Chapter 5 place accurately portrays Volron and his overall mentality. So once again, credit. That's good. That's awesome. The total oppression, the big fanciful architecture with nobody in it. Again, surface level, right? It's what I already told you about. Volron is extremely surface level. He's the kind of person who would make this big, fancy-looking feast that has absolutely no nutritional value. He's the kind of person who would make a giant castle filled with extravagance that has no use or reason for existing. Not for people, not for function, not for anything. Pure surface level. I am the sovereign, the end. Now, I suppose I should talk about the big twist, but honestly, I felt really weird because when they finally revealed the big twist, my first thought was, didn't we already know that? Like, I thought pretty early on that it was fairly obvious that the planet Rena was our villain, and that it was our villain because we already knew, because I've already mentioned, that too much spirit energy in one spot can form and coalesce into a form of sentience. So, okay. So, and it's draining all the energy from our planet, Dana. Okay, so it's this evil force that's trying to absorb all the energy and eat it. Okay, cool. And then they spend 3 hours expositing on this, and I'm like, but... So I don't actually have anything to say about that. It's an interesting idea, but I don't think they actually do anything with it. And honestly, I can think of several other Tales of games or JRPGs in general which take these similar concepts and actually run with them as opposed to just kind of throwing it in at the end. I've said this before and I'll say this again. I really think this game doesn't use its length properly, and as a consequence should have been chopped off several hours earlier than it is. But, still a good game. I don't think I have anything else to add on top of that. Next up, we're going to be trying out Suikoden 1 specifically. A much shorter game, I'm pretty sure. So we'll see how that goes. And I hope to see you for there next time.